Welcome back to lecture number 20 on a series of upheavals in Asia during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, World Wars I and II were real eye-openers for some French and British colonists overseas. What many people don't realize is that there were Southeast Asian troops who fought in both World War I and World War II. For instance, almost 100,000 Vietnamese went to Europe to fight and serve on behalf of the French, and perhaps as many as 30,000 perished in World War I. Take a look at the chart here on the slide. You'll notice that Britain's colonial holdings in India resulted in a very large number, more than 1 million Indian troops also served in World War I on behalf of the Allied war effort. Now, the British and the French had made lots of promises to gain the support of colonial peoples during the war. For example, French representatives suggested to Syrian nationalists in 1917 that Syria would have self-government during the war. Britain also led India to expect much more independence after the war if they provided soldiers. After the wars, however, we still see Allied statesmen saying, well, we didn't really mean it. You know, we're still going to see a push for independence in many areas, but the British and the French are going to say, well, we're not ready yet. You're not ready yet for full independence. Maybe we'll do it 10 years from now, 20 years from now. They just kept putting them off. In the case of British-dominated India, there's a lot of money on the line for the British. Remember, we talked about the British East India Company several lectures ago. This is a major money maker for the British Crown, is controlling the trade in items such as cotton, indigo, tea, opium. And for the British, they had set up extensive political and military control throughout the Indian subcontinent. They had paid for infrastructure projects such as railroads, telegraph systems, postal systems. From the standpoint of the British, they are not inclined to let the local independence leaders have their way. And so even before both world wars, by the middle of the 19th century, we have such a strong push for independence among many quarters in the Indian subcontinent that we will see the first rebellion, or Indian Revolt as the British call it, the Sepoy Rebellion. Now, if you'll recall from several lectures ago, we talked about the Sepoys were Indian troops that had been trained by the British. Now, in the case of the Sepoy Rebellion, those troops that should have been loyal to Britain now will turn on the British, demanding independence for their people. And the reason why they're revolting are many different factors. Native Indians, for instance, were not allowed to serve in their own government. The British had been trying to dismantle the caste system in India for years, and for the Indian nationalists, they said, if it's not broke, don't fix it. A high taxation system that was established by the British was considered to be exploitative to the native Indians. Large landholders in the north were upset that British authorities were simply taking their land from them, seizing their vast estates, and redistributing it to the peasantry. Now, this rebellion will ultimately be unsuccessful because the British do have superior weaponry. They have the ability to go into these hot spots, especially in the north, and settle things down by buying off local leaders. But even though it was brief, the Sepoy Rebellion was bad from the standpoint of, once more, of civilian casualties. An estimated 800,000 people lost their lives, many of them from famine, as refugee populations began desperately seeking a way to get away from all the death and destruction around them. Now, while the first attempt on the part of Indian nationalists to achieve their freedom from Britain's domination failed, we will see it rejuvenate during the early 20th century under the leadership of Mohandas or Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi is often considered to be the father of the Indian independence movement. He will train to become an attorney. He will actually travel to South Africa, where for years he will have a successful attorney office. And he will return back to India over time, determined to liberate his people from the dominance of the British. He began fasting. He took a vow of celibacy to purify his body. He began organizing mass events, peaceful events, to protest British domination of the subcontinent. And I'm emphasizing these peaceful movements because I want to draw your attention to the notion of satyagraha. This term means truth force. It is a non-violent way of protesting against injustices. Gandhi began advocating for self-reliance as a way to gain freedom from the British. For example, the Indians were supplying Britain with raw materials and then importing expensive woven cloth from England. Why not industrialize ourselves? So Gandhi led economic boycotts of British-made goods. The British, of course, are not fond of this independence movement, and there will be severe beatings and jailings of many of those that support Gandhi's movement. Finally, after World War II in 1947, Britain will decide to exit India. However, we will immediately see issues come to a head between the Muslim minority and the Hindu majority in India. In fact, Gandhi will be assassinated in 1948 by a Hindu nationalist who thought he was being too accommodating to the Muslim minority. The next leader of an independent India, Nehru, he is the first prime minister of the independent country of India, and he faces a lot of challenges. In this role, he will implement a series of moderate socialist economic reforms. He will commit India to a policy of rapid industrialization to try to catch the country up with other areas of the world. He will create a free public education system and provide meals for Indian children from poor backgrounds. Legal rights will be granted for women, such as the ability to inherit property and divorce their husbands, and laws were passed to prohibit discrimination based upon caste affiliation. Now, as you might imagine, as India becomes an independent entity, both sides on the Cold War are looking to ally with India, right? The Soviet Union would love to have it as a Soviet state, a communist state. The United States, Great Britain, they want it to become a Western-style capitalist democracy. So Nehru is really threading the needle here. He is trying to not align with either side. He basically is saying, we've got too much on our plate. We're not going to commit to one side or the other. And they certainly do have a lot to talk about with the coming issue of the partition of India. We are going to see that the religious differences between the Muslim minority and the Hindu majority are going to come to, unfortunately, open violence by the time we get to late 1947, early 1948. Muslims in India feared not having any political power if there was an independent India. They thought that their voices would simply get drowned out. Thus, the Muslims wanted 6 provinces in northwest India, which had majority populations of people of their faith. They wanted it to become an independent nation. While Gandhi had vigorously protested against this, we will see violence break out on the ground. The raping, slaughter, and burning of entire towns. The British, witnessing what looked like a looming civil war, decided to leave in 1947 without fixing this issue. And so basically what we will see is when India becomes an independent country, it becomes a Hindu majority country, and Pakistan will come into being. These northwestern Muslim-dominated territories will come into being. 2 different countries. And unfortunately, even to the present day, Pakistan and India have ongoing border disputes. Now let's turn to China. If ever there was a country during the 19th century that was bedeviled by European meddling in it, it was China. If you'll recall our discussion of the Opium Wars, for instance, of the 19th century, the Boxer Rebellion and its aftermath, all of these revealed the weaknesses of the imperial Qing government to defend itself against these foreign powers. Even after the revolution of 1911, which finally did away with the Qing dynasty, the country still they still failed to unify themselves, where they could still defend themselves against outside domination. Now, after the revolution of 1911, we will start to see Marxist ideas trickling into the country by the 1920s and 30s. The communist idea of the state appropriating lands and the means of production seemed very attractive in China, especially to poor peasants who tended to be among the first to die in massive famines where they were seemingly ignored by their own government over time. What we will see is ultimately a struggle between nationalist forces who do not want communism in China and the Chinese Communist Revolution, its success under Mao Zedong. China will turn into a communist nation after a lot of bloodshed and fighting. And part of how Mao Zedong and his forces will be able to subdue the nationalist forces, which will then flee to the island of Taiwan, is by, trying to get unity among the masses, among the peasantry. In order to enlist the aid of the masses, we will see that Mao Zedong will treat a number of revolutionary leaders ruthlessly. Some 800,000 will be executed as soon as he takes power, many more arrested, with the goal of destroying all traces of former bureaucratic leadership, landlords, and capitalism. A strong, centralized communist state was then established. Industry came under state ownership. China's farmers began to be organized into collectives or communes. Strict censorship of all printed materials. A cult of personality will be enacted, whereby you can see posters like this showing Mao Zedong as like the sun in the sky. A lot of this kind of politics of personality will be advanced, and also purges. Propaganda was everywhere. You would have public address systems saying, work, 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 work for the communist state, be loyal to Mao Zedong. And anyone that offered any sort of resistance to this would simply be purged. They would be disappeared. Many of them sent to work camps or simply executed. Widespread fear, therefore, starts to take hold in the country. Mao Zedong will also commence an ambitious project to rapidly industrialize China. He begins pulling farmers out of the fields and instead putting them to work into factories without adequate training. Meanwhile, less food is being grown in China, and what that means for a massive population is famines will start to result. We will also see a devastating environmental effect of this rapid program of forced industrialization. Some 80% of China's forests were felled in the years after the introduction of the so-called Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward was Mao Zedong's plan to rapidly industrialize China. Essentially, he sought to modernize and industrialize the country in only a 5 to 10 year period of time, while it had taken 60 plus years for countries like Britain to do that. In other words, there's some things you can't rush, at least not without many, many people dying, which will happen as a result of this Great Leap Forward. And in fact, the thing that he hates the most, those critics of him, eventually he's beginning to feel some heat. People saying, we're making shoddy machinery that won't hold up over time because these workers don't know how to operate the machines. We are pulling farmers out of the fields. People are starving en masse. He's starting to receive a great deal of criticism over time. So in a bid to reassert his authority and take away criticism, Mao launched what became known as the Cultural Revolution in China. In this way, he will send out spies. He will encourage neighbors to look in on other neighbors, to report if anyone was criticizing him or his cultural programs. He sought to purge China of old influences that he felt like were keeping the working class oppressed. Old customs, old habits, old culture, and old ideas. He will organize the youth of China into Red Guards by the millions. They will be given their little red books full of Marxist maxims and quotations by Mao. Then he unleashed these adolescents on everyone around him. Those who had anything other than a communist background were challenged and often charged for corruption and sent to prison or labor camps, if not executed outright. Teachers and professors were singled out as corrupting influences by talking about other forms of government instead of communism. Many public executions took place. Millions of people will die as a result of the Cultural Revolution, and much of the country's cultural heritage was destroyed. Libraries were burned, homes and museums were ransacked. I mean, really, what do you expect to happen when you give the power of life or death to a 7th grader? They're going to turn on their parents. They're going to turn on their teachers. Ultimately, after all of this death and despair, we will see that a whole lost generation of youth in China will come of age between 1967 and 1976. And in 1964, from a technological standpoint, China will hold its first successful test of an atomic weapon, and they will begin pulling away from the domination of the Soviet Union. Even after his death, the legacy of Mao lives on in China. It's still a government that is dominating the private sector in that country. There still exists strict censorship of the internet, media, and speech, and student protesters killed from time to time, such as the Tiananmen Square massacre in Beijing in 1989.